The bell tolls again, lower, this time, slower, like a throat struggling to speak a final word. Its echo folds into the morning fog, lost among frostbitten thatch and shuttered windows. Somewhere, a dog whines and is silenced by a sharp voice. The villagers do not stir. They remain ringed around her, motionless, like figures carved from old ashwood, watching, breathing, waiting. The girl does not cry. Her lips are chapped, but set. Her eyes trace the steam rising from the brass bowl in the priest's hands. Holy water, they call it, but it smells of old iron and moss. She knows what it is. She knows what it means. Behind her, the fire crackles louder now, no longer a whisper, but a promise. They have dressed her in plain linen, cinched with a rope, that once bound wheat for harvest. Her ankles are bare against the frozen mud, and though she trembles, it is not from the cold. She is remembering the first time she felt the fire, not the blaze behind her now, but the fire of being seen, too closely, too strangely, when she spoke of dreams that later came true, when she laid herbs at the door of a coughing child and watched him recover, when a sheep gave birth wrong and she reached inside it like her mother had taught her and turned the lamb gently, gently, and pulled it out silent. But they remembered the silence more than the saving. A child who does not speak is a blessing. A woman who does not speak is obedient. But a girl who speaks to things that are not seen is something else entirely. The priest steps forward. His robes are damp at the hem from dew. He raises the bowl, and the Latin begins again, winding through the morning like a rope spun from another century. In nomen patris et filii et spiritus sancti. He dips a sprig of yew into the water, shakes it over her bound hands. Droplets cling to her skin like cold pearls. She does not flinch. A crow shifts above them, black wings spreading against the pewter sky. It calls out once, then again, then silence. The villagers do not meet her gaze. Not the butcher whose daughter she nursed through fever. Not the blacksmith's wife who once asked her for tansy in secret. Not the miller who gave her a ride on his cart when she was too small to walk the long road home. They do not look at her, because to look would be to remember, and memory, here, is dangerous. The priest speaks now of justice, of the fires, purity of God's judgment made visible through flame. He does not speak of the times the fire has lied, of blisters on the hands of widows, of drowned girls buried in unmarked graves, of boys who never woke after 3 days of fever from trial. Wounds. These are not things the church records. These are not stories written in the sacred texts. Only the villagers remember, and even they, over time, forget. She is led to the iron frame, the one they built after the last girl. Her hands are unbound, just long enough to hold the staff. A branding rod, long and flat, already resting near the flames. Its tip glows orange. The priest nods solemnly. 3 paces. Across hot iron. If her feet blister. Guilty if they do not. Innocent, but she will not be healed either way. The girl takes a breath, but it catches in her throat. She is not afraid of pain. She is afraid of what will be left of her when the pain is over. She steps. 1. The heat licks at her soles, like a serpent. The pain is instant, but sharp, contained. To the scent of her own skin rises, bitter and familiar, like the smokehouse when her father salted meat. Long ago. 3. Her knees buckle, but she stays upright. The staff is taken from her hand. Silence falls again. Even the wind holds its breath. Then a scream, not hers, from the crowd. A child wails. A young boy, no older than 6, breaks from the ring of villagers and runs toward her. His mother catches him just in time, pressing his face into her shoulder. His sobs echo across the square like bells tolling too fast. Too late, the priest approaches. He kneels before her, inspecting her feet, now wrapped in cloth. Bloodstains the linen already. He looks up. God has judged her, he says, but no. One cheers. No one moves. The girl is lifted by 2 monks and carried back into the chapel, where she will be watched for 3 days. If the wounds fester, the devil is in her. If they heal clean, she will be set free, though none say what that freedom means, where she will go, what she will be, who will take her in as they vanish through the chapel doors. The crowd begins to disperse. The fire is left to die slowly. Only the smoke remains, rising into the sky like a question no one wants to answer. That night, the village sleeps uneasily. Children cry in dreams they won't remember. Men roll over with guilt they cannot name. Women wash their hands longer at the basin in the chapel. The girl lies still, wrapped in wool. Her feet throb like drumbeats against the edge of sleep. She listens to the wind through the cracked stones. Somewhere outside, a raven calls again. She does not know if she will live, but she knows this. The trial was not a test. It was a ritual, not meant to uncover guilt, but to remind the village of its power, of its control, of how quickly silence can be enforced by fire, and how deeply truth must be buried beneath ash to keep from returning. But truth always returns, in dreams, in herbs, in the trembling hands of girls who remember too much. And in the next village, just across the river, another girl is waking, her hands cupped round a dying bird, whispering something her mother once said in secret. She doesn't yet know. She'll be next, but the fire does. It always does. She stirs before dawn, not from sleep, for she has not slept, not truly, but from the sound, low, rhythmic, distant. Hooves. The first cart of the day dragging through frozen ruts beyond the chapel wall. The wood moans under weight. The wheels crack like brittle bones. Her breath hangs in the air. Her body aches from the fever blooming in her feet, but she does not cry out. Pain, by now, is not a stranger. It is the only thing keeping her from disappearing completely. She watches a strand of cobweb tremble in the window's corner, lit by the earliest light. Dust moves like ash in the beam. She wonders if the raven has returned, if it waits for her, if it ever left. The chapel is silent. The monks have not yet entered. Her watchers do not pray. They stand like statues beside the stone arch. One, with a pockmarked face and burnt fingertips. The other with lips that never move. Both saw her trial. Both helped bind her hands. She can feel the shape of their touch, still impressed in her skin. It does not matter if they meant to harm her. They did. The wool around her feet is damp now. Not from sweat. The wounds have opened again in the night. Each heartbeat sends a throb of fire through her soles. She tries not to move. Somewhere in the chapel, the old bell rope sways slightly, not wrung, just breathing. Time stretches she. Thinks of her mother's fingers, stained from nettles and ash. How they'd braid her hair while whispering stories the priests said were pagan lies. Her mother believed in balance, not punishment. That nature corrected itself, and those who listened could walk between storms. But her mother is gone now, taken not by trial or fire, but by the sickness that bloomed in her lungs one winter and never left. No one prayed for her. They only waited for her home to grow cold enough to claim. On the third day, the bishop arrives. His boots echo on the flagstone. His ring is kissed by the monk. He does not speak to her, only gestures. The cloth is unwrapped. She does not look. She cannot. But she hears it. The hiss in the bishop's throat. The quiet intake of breath. The slow, considered exhale of someone who knows exactly what they're about to say, and exactly what it will cost. The wounds are clean, he murmurs. The monk beside him bows. Another bows deeper, a ritual of agreement. She may be freed, says the bishop, but no one tells her where to go. No one asks if she can walk. They leave her food, a thick black crust of bread, a bowl of lentils, water with floating specks of dust. She eats what she can. The rest she buries in the straw, waits for someone to guide her. None do dot by dusk. She is standing, barefoot still, the soles bandaged in linen. She leans on the wall to stay upright. One step, then another. The air outside hits her like a river, so cold it feels alive. The wind licks the blood from her lips. She pulls her shawl tight. The square is empty, no. Children play, no merchants call. Only the echo of the bell's memory remains. She begins to walk through the village, past the houses that once called her neighbor, past the threshold where she dried herbs, past the man who once gave her a basket of eggs, who now lowers his eyes and closes his door without a word. There is no celebration, no absolution, only retreat. She walks toward the edge of the village, toward the fields, toward the forest, toward the river. No one follows. She crosses the frost-bitten bridge just as the sun begins to die behind the trees, bleeding gold into the sky. Ravens call across the branches. One circles. She does not look up. There is a tree, the one she used to sit beneath when her mother read from the worn book of psalms and spells, the one that still leans, half split by lightning, but rooted all the same. She lowers herself to the ground beneath it. Her legs give way easily. The earth is hard, but it holds her, and, for the first time in days, she weeps not because she lived, but because she now understands what that survival means. She has been named innocent by flame, but she has also been marked. There is no returning to who she was, to the girl who listened to the wind and the barley, to the daughter who kissed her mother's cheeks and whispered charms. That girl was burned away, even if the fire never touched her skin. This is what trials do. They don't only kill, they carve, and now, from this shape they've carved into her, she must decide what to become. She reaches into the folds of her cloak. There, tied into the hem, is a small pouch, her mother's, still filled with dried sage and crushed chamomile, still carrying the scent of hearth, smoke and oil and grief. She crushes the herbs. Between her fingers, breathes them in. The wind shifts. It smells of damp leaves and ash and something older, something waiting across the river. Another village sleeps. Another priest prepares tomorrow's sermon. Another accusation waits in a child's whisper or a midwife's glance. But here, under the split tree, she sharpens her breath like a blade and waits. She will not go back, but she will not disappear. There are other girls, other trials, and perhaps, one day, someone will not be alone when the bell tolls. The fire will still burn, but this time, someone might hold their hand, or speak, or remember. The sky deepens to violet. The first star appears. She closes her eyes, not in resignation, but in choosing dot, and in the distance, far beyond the trees, the The sound of hooves again, slow, steady, and drawing closer. The hooves came at night, no procession, no torches, only the soft rhythm of leather on frost and the creak of wood as a cart pulled its burden toward the chapel doors. The village did not wake, or rather, it chose not to. Windows stayed shuttered, candles flickered out, doors bolted in silence. Fear has a way of making people sleep with both eyes closed. Inside, the cart was a man, barely. His limbs were bound with cloth soaked in dried blood, his face bruised beyond recognition. His tunic clung to him like wet parchment, torn and darkened from the waist down. His hair, once noble, was matted with soot and spit and the muck of dungeons. One of his fingers had been broken and reset. Crookedly, the mark of steel remained across his collarbone, a chain too tight for too long. He had been a knight once, but no longer. Now he was an accused. The charge was treason. Not the kind sung of in ballads, but the quiet kind, a whispered word of dissent at the wrong feast, an ill-timed glance toward the king's daughter, or perhaps the sin of surviving a war where too many noble sons had died. The kind of treason no one names, but everyone punishes. He had refused confession. That much the monks knew, and so he would face a trial, not by fire, not by water, by ordeal of the cross, in the old Roman way. Two men would stand, arms outstretched, as Christ had, facing each other. They would remain that way for as long as their strength allowed. The one who dropped his arms first was guilty. God, it was said, would grant endurance to the innocent. The other man had already been chosen, a merchant's son, thin, devout, eager to please the church. He was promised coin, an absolution the knight had asked for no such thing. The trial would begin at sunrise. In a clearing behind the chapel, where the frost lingered longest, they marked 2 stones in the soil. An altar was set between them, a candle lit at its center. 2 cloaks were laid aside, 2 cups of watered wine untouched. The villagers came at dawn, drawn by rumor, more than belief. Children perched on fences, old men leaned on canes with blank eyes. The baker crossed herself twice. The smith whispered a bet. The bishop arrived in silence, flanked by guards, and then the knight. He did not limp, though his knees trembled. He walked with a dignity that did not ask permission. His wrists were unbound, his hands cracked but steady. When he reached the stone, he looked not at the bishop, not at the crowd, but at the tree line beyond, as if searching for something, lost dot or someone. The merchant's son took his place beside the other stone. He shivered, though the wind had died. The bishop raised his hand, and the trial began. Both men lifted their arms, palms open, eyes forward. The silence thickened like fog. At first, nothing changed. The villagers murmured, some chuckled. A woman offered bread to her daughter. Time drifted gently, like a feather on still air. But then the tremors began, small at first, in the merchant's fingers, then his elbows. His eyes darted toward the bishop, then to the crowd, then to the sky. Sweat pooled beneath his collar. The knight did not move, his arms outstretched like branches, long dead but still unbroken. His gaze remained fixed. A fly landed on his cheek. He did not blink. Minutes passed, or hours. Time bends in the presence. Of pain, the merchant's son staggered. A gasp rippled through the crowd. He corrected himself, straightened, but too late his arms twitched, and his left shoulder dropped just enough. The bishop nodded once. It was done, the knight's arms lowered. Not in victory, but in mercy. The merchant collapsed, weeping. The crowd dispersed uneasy. No one looked at the knight. No one spoke his name. He was led back to the chapel, freed, in word if not in spirit. That night he sat alone by the chapel's hearth, wrapped in wool and silence. His breath rose in slow clouds. The monks did not approach. He drank the wine he'd refused earlier, slowly, without joy. He had survived, but survival was not vindication. His lands were gone, his titles erased. His brother wore his coat of arms now. His sword had been melted down to coins and rings and chalices. There would be no feast for his return, no son to teach, no horse waiting by the gates. He remembered. The war, the fields soaked in blood, the screams under banners. The moment he had hesitated, not out of fear, but out of honor, and how that hesitation had cost him everything. He touched the scar on his wrist. A gift from a chain meant to hold him until judgment. He thought of the girl, the one they'd tried in fire. He had seen her trial before they took him. He remembered the way she stood, the way she did not plead, the silence in her eyes that echoed the same, silence in his own. He wondered if she had lived. He hoped she had not returned. The fire crackled softly. He looked into it, not for warmth but for memory, for something that would make this survival mean more than mere endurance. Beyond the chapel walls, the forest breathed. Somewhere under a split tree, a girl sharpened her breath, and somewhere beyond that, in another village, another charge was being written, another accusation whispered, and another trial prepared. The knight stood slowly. His legs ached, his arms still burned, but his eyes were steady. He walked toward the door, not to flee, but to begin again, because those who walk from fire and cross are not saved, they are changed, and what they choose to do next. That is what history never writes down. Only memory remembers it, only silence carries it forward, and somewhere in that silence, someone waits. The river had frozen overnight. Thin ice crusted its edges like cracked glass, and a milky fog hung low over the banks, muffling hoofbeats and blurring the outline of the trees. It was quiet, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that pressed into the bones, not from rest, but from waiting. The girl sat beneath the split tree, wrapped in what remained of her cloak, its seams stiff with frost. Her breath unfurled in long threads. Her hands cracked and reddened, cradled a stone bowl filled with cold ash and dried herbs. Sage, lavender rue, the last her mother had. Ever grown, she had not moved in hours, not since the first call of the raven, not since the ache in her feet returned with the hard frost, not since she dreamed again of the fire. She was not running. She had never run. She had only left, slowly, step by step, unwelcomed, unwarned. And yet her name still echoed in the air behind her like smoke that would not fade. A name tied to trial, to guilt, to the kind of silence people do not speak of, but do not forget. She heard the cart before she saw it, with groaning, hooves dragging through ruts in the mud. She rose slowly. Every part of her body ached, not just from wounds, but from the weight of having survived. The weight of having nowhere to place that survival. Two figures rode in the back, one upright, the other curled beneath a blanket. The upright one was a boy, no older than 10. His eyes were wide, hollow, already older than his face. He clutched something in his lap, a bundle wrapped in cloth. It trembled once, then went still. The other was his sister. She had been accused of consorting with shadows, of whispering to the wind, of causing the death of a noble's hound with nothing more than a glance. The same story with different names, different faces, the same ritual repeated across villages, across centuries. They had tried to drown her, but the rope snapped. The boy had pulled her from the river himself, and now they ran not to save her name, but to keep her body from becoming another. Sermon. The girl stepped forward from the tree. The boy flinched, but she raised one hand, not in warning, in welcome. There were no words, only gestures now. She helped lift the girl from the cart. Her skin was ice, her lips blue, but she breathed weakly, like a candle not yet extinguished. Inside the hollow, beneath the tree, they made a space, lined it with pine boughs, covered it with what wool they had. And then they waited, not for rescue, for warmth, for the old way, the waiting way, where healing comes, not from hands, but from presence. That night, the girl did not sleep. She listened to the child breathe, listened to the fire they built, crack and spit, listened to the silence beneath it all, a silence too wide to name. The boy sat close. He spoke rarely, but once, near dawn, he whispered something. They said the water would speak, he said, but all it did was drown her. The girl nodded. She had heard that lie too. She thought of the bishop, of the village, of the way everyone had looked away, because looking meant remembering, because truth, once seen, demands something, and most people would rather forget. By morning, the fever had broken. The child stirred, opened her eyes, not fully, but enough. The first thing she saw was not the fire, not the frost, but the girl who had survived, and something passed between them, a thread, invisible, unspoken, unbreakable. It would be weeks before the child could walk, and in that time they stayed, the three of them, under the tree. The boy fetched roots and water from the creek, even in snow. The girl ground herbs, wrapped burns, whispered songs too old for scripture, and the child healed, not entirely, not evenly, but enough to stand, enough to breathe without trembling. And when the sun rose high enough one day to melt the edges of the river, they knew it was time, not to return, but to move forward. They followed the old paths, not marked on any map, the ones used by women long forgotten, midwives, exiles, keepers of the green faith, the ones who disappeared when the trials began, but left behind signs carved into stone, into trees. Into memory they found others, one by one, a widow who once healed with mushrooms and had been branded on both palms, a boy who escaped the monastery after the relic burned his dreams, a woman who'd watched her daughter be taken and vowed never to let it happen again. They gathered in secret, not to hide, but to remember, and in that remembering they built something, not a rebellion, a refuge, stone by stone, herb by herb, story by story, and beneath the split tree, now circled with standing stones and fire pits, they swore no more girls would burn, not without being seen, not without being held, not without someone naming what the fire was truly for. It was not about justice, it never was. It was about fear, about silence, about power, and they had all survived it. But survival, they knew now, was only the beginning, because to survive is to carry the flame forward, not the one that burns, the one that lights, that warms, that remembers. And one day, a man came to them, scarred, tall, his hands still shaking from the cross, ordeal, he said only one word when he arrived. Her. And the girl knew he meant the trial, not his own, hers. He had seen her, long ago, through smoke, and now he had followed the memory of her fire into the forest. He knelt not in reverence, in recognition, and she reached down, her hand once burned, now steady, and helped him rise. They said nothing more that day. There would be time, because the trials had not ended, but neither had the stories, and somewhere, in another village, another accusation had just been spoken. But this time, something had changed. This time, the fire might find itself watched. This time, the silence might be broken. This time, someone would remember, and beneath the tree that split but never fell, a new fire crackled, not for judgment, but for gathering, and its smoke rose, not like a question, but like an answer, one the wind would carry. It was raining when they arrived, not the gentle kind that softens the earth, but a cold, needling rain that made no sound as it fell. It slicked the bark of trees and clung to cloaks. It turned the ash path to muck. The fire beneath the split tree hissed in protest but never died. They had come in silence, a group of 4, led by a woman wrapped in a black wool shawl that trailed in the dirt behind her like mourning cloth. Her eyes were ringed with shadows, but she held herself like someone who had not been allowed to grieve. Behind her, a man with a torn surcoat, a hollow cheek, and hands that never stopped shaking. Beside him, a boy no older than 12, barefoot and half-starved, and at the back, the 4th, a girl, unmarked, untouched, but hiding something deep inside her like a blade. She dared not draw. They did not ask for shelter. They only asked to be seen. The rain made everything quiet. Even the birds had retreated. And so the girl, the first girl, the one who had walked across flame and lived, stepped forward and led them in. No questions, no ceremony, only firelight and the sound of the pots simmering in the earthstone. Hearth, roots, lentils, bone broth seasoned with rosemary and silence. They warmed themselves, and slowly, wordlessly, they began to unburden. The woman spoke first, when the others had fallen into uneasy sleep. Her voice was low, like a candle almost extinguished. They killed him before the trial. The man, she meant, her husband, a healer, not accused, just suspected. He had cured the Reeves, son of fever, with nothing but boiled pine bark and honey. And when the priest's prayers had failed, the villagers whispered, not thanks, not awe, but fear. The priest called it unnatural. By morning, they'd found him hanging from the apothecary door. Not a sentence, not a verdict, just a warning. The woman had taken the boy, her nephew, and fled. The girl had followed, a neighbor's daughter. No one knew her name now. The church had taken it when they took her mother. She hadn't spoken since Dot, until now. As the rain thickened into sleet, the girl reached into her satchel and drew out a scrap of fabric, stiff with old blood. She held it out, embroidered into the corner. Just barely visible in the firelight was a sigil, a 6-pointed star inside. A broken circle. None of the others recognized it, but the first girl did. It had once marked the door of the midwife, who taught her mother. It had once meant, safe here. It was older than the church, older than any trial, a symbol from the time when knowledge was kept in hands, not in books and passed down through songs, not scripture. She took the cloth gently, pressed it to her lips. Then she whispered something into the fire. A word not in Latin, not even in English. Something older, something spoken only between those who remembered what the world once was, before it was bound in iron and guilt. The girl who had walked through fire, began to teach, not doctrine, not rebellion, but remembering. She taught them how to tell the difference between mugwort and wormwood in the dark, how to read the sky for frost, how to grind willow bark for pain, and yarrow for fever. She taught the silent girl how to press rosemary into wax, and the boy how to listen to bees, and in return, they told her what the world had become, how trials had shifted. They no longer needed fire or water now. A mere suspicion could erase someone. A girl asked too many questions. A widow lingered too long at a grave. A boy cried during Mass. These were enough, no proof, no wound, no sin, just enough fear. The Church had learned how to make execution look like salvation, and no one needed to burn anymore, because everyone had already learned how to stay silent. But here, beneath the canopy of ash and elder, something was stirring. Not vengeance. That was never the goal, but protection. A shield of memory. A net of names. A fire that lit gently, like a lantern passed hand to hand. They began to leave signs in chalk on the backs of market stalls, in herbs tied to the doors of the ill, in bread baked in certain shapes, crescents, loops, twists, each meaning something different. Safe here, water is clean. Beware the priest. The signs spread slowly, quietly, like vines in the walls of a forgotten tower, and soon word reached them of a woman in the southern marshes who had gathered 14 girls after a failed trial, of a boy in the stone hills who wrote down every accusation he ever witnessed and buried them in jars with dates and names, of a monk who carved a new gospel, one with no saints, only survivors, and hid it inside a hollowed-out altar, and the girl who had once stood barefoot in the square, rope around her wrists, saw what had always been. True, the trials had been built to make them forget, but memory had never stopped, burning not in books, not in sermons, but in breath, in scar, in silence. One night the boy asked her, "Will they find us?" She answered without turning, "They already have." He grew quiet, "But what will they do?" She stirred the fire. Ash spiraled like stars. "They'll try what they always do. But this time, we're not waiting." A raven called from the trees, and the sleet turned to snow. They watched it fall for hours. The girl no longer felt the cold. She had become the kind of flame that could not be doused, only passed on, and as morning broke over the frost-covered forest, more figures emerged from the mist. Not many, not loud, but enough to begin. Something, not a war, not a revolt, but a remembering, a gathering of those who had survived the silence, and would now teach others to hear. Because what trials feared most was not resistance, it was memory, and the ones who had lived through fire had begun to speak. The snow did not melt, not for days. It clung to the branches like pale lace, draped over the world with a hush so complete, even the birds dared not sing. Beneath the canopy of frost and ash, the clearing around the split tree had grown still, a place untouched, preserved, as if time itself had stopped to listen. But deep beneath the snow, life stirred. It stirred in hands, grinding dried mint into powder, in smoke rising from a clay oven, in the rhythm of footsteps pressed into the earth by those who had come seeking something they could not name. They came not because they were called. No one dared speak aloud what this place was. They came because something had been taken from them, a mother, a sister, a name, a truth, and this was where the silence broke. There were no banners, No signs, only the fire and the memory. They called it the Hollow, a place beyond the reach of roads or laws. It had no walls, only trees. No gate, only a path twisted with ash leaves. But it held more safety than any castle, more witness than any court. It was built on what the world had thrown away, the forgotten, the accused, the marked, the misnamed. The girl, now older, stronger, stood beneath the tree as she had once before, but no longer afraid, no longer the trial's victim. She was the one they watched now, the one they turned to when someone arrived shaking, bloodied, silent. She did not preach, she did not lead, she remembered and remembering. Here was enough to guide. That morning a stranger arrived, not walking, not fleeing, but on horseback, wrapped in heavy wool and soaked from days of travel. His cloak bore no crest, his face obscured by a hood, revealed only a scar beneath one eye, clean, deliberate, a mark left not by war but by judgment. He dismounted, slowly, stiff with cold. The others watched from the shadows, ready, cautious, quiet. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak. He reached into his saddlebag, and from within he drew a small bundle, wrapped in pale linen and sealed with wax. He placed it at the base of the tree and stepped back. The girl approached. The others watched her carefully, still, protective, still remembering the fire that first shaped them. She knelt before the bundle, broke the seal and unwrapped it slowly. Inside were pages, dozens dot, each covered in dense handwriting dates, names, places, confessions, retractions, witnesses who'd changed their stories, priests who had lied, monks who had written one truth and spoken another, entire trials recorded in detail, and every one of them ending the same way. A death, an exile, a vanishing. He had brought them records, not sermons, evidence. He removed his hood. He was older than she had guessed, perhaps once noble, though. That word meant little here. His eyes were not pleading, not proud, only tired. I kept them, he said, every one they made me read, every lie I was forced to sign. I thought if I stayed silent, it would pass. He looked away, it didn't. The girl rose. She nodded once, not in forgiveness, in understanding. That night they built a new fire, larger, brighter. At its center, the girl laid the bundle of records. One by one, she read the names aloud, slowly, clearly, as if calling them back from wherever silence had buried them. Each name burned into the night, like a prayer, not for salvation, for justice. And as the flames rose, the stranger knelt, not to repent, but to listen. And the hollow changed until now. It had been a place of refuge, but that night it became something more, a place of witness. Those who came now brought stories, yes, but also proof, pages, tokens, fragments of letters and ledgers, marks left behind by a church too proud to erase everything. They smuggled in burned books from monastery fires, ripped pages sewn into hymns, names memorized by children and whispered. Across years, they began to build a record, not a gospel, a reckoning. Each scroll was written in iron ink, stored in clay vessels, buried beneath stones marked with runes. If one was taken, 3 more remained. If one was burned, 10 were rewritten. No secret could be kept forever, not anymore. And then the girl began to travel. Not far, not loudly, but purposefully. 2 villages still gripped by the trials. 2 places where fear held breath hostage and children slept with shoes by the door. She walked with a basket and a staff, and no one knew her name. She was just a healer, a widow, a quiet thing, invisible. But she was watching, listening. She would stop by the well, draw water, speak to the washerwomen, ask about dreams, about disappearances, about girls who were once loud and now were not. And when she left, she would leave behind more than herbs. She left signs, coded marks beneath windows, ash bundles in the rafters, chalk lines across thresholds. And when the fire came again, and it always did, someone was already there, waiting to lead them out, to take them to the hollow. And for the first time in 100 winters, some trials failed. The rope would be cut, the fire would not light, the accused would be gone, and the church, so used to silence, began to notice. They sent hunters, inquisitors, pale men with thin smiles and hard hands. They did not preach, they did not ask, they only took, and they always came at night. But the hollow was no longer alone. It had spread, carried in memory, in name, in flame, and when one refuge fell, another rose. The girl knew they could not win in battle. This was not a war of swords, it was a war of forgetting, and she had built an army of remembering. One night, as the frost returned and the fire burned low, the boy, now older, now stronger, sat beside her. He had once asked, "Will they find us?" Now he asked, "When they do, what then?" She turned to him, and her voice was soft. "Then they will learn," she said, "that we are not afraid of fire." He did not answer. He only reached forward and fed another branch into the flames, and as the sparks rose, curling into the sky, like names, the snow began to fall again. Soft, silent, unstoppable. The fire had not gone out. Not after the snow, not after the frost, not even after the riders came in the night, iron-shod and silent, with leather armor that gleamed like wet stone. They brought no words, only torches. And when they left, 3 shelters smoldered in ruin, and the names of 2 missing girls hung in the air like unanswered prayers. But the fire still burned not. The flames they'd tried to douse, but the other one. The fire in the remembering. The fire in the breath. The fire in the knowing that survival was no longer enough. They had struck the hollow, and the hollow had endured. When dawn broke, the clearing did not cry. They rebuilt with hands steady from sorrow and sharpened by resolve. A new shelter rose where the smoke still curled from the earth. It was not beautiful, it was not comfortable, but it stood. And in its center, someone carved a phrase into the beam with a rusted nail. "We carry the names." That morning, no one spoke. Of revenge, they spoke of rebuilding, of reaching farther, of making it so that next time no one had to run, no one had to hide. The girl stood beneath the split tree and listened to them. These voices once silenced by trials, now planning routes, mapping safe houses, memorizing paths through old woods and riverbeds. She did not command, she listened, and as the firelight flickered over the faces of those who had once been ash-marked and accused, she saw something new, not fear, not even hope, but direction. The hollow, she knew now, was no longer a place. It was a way of being. It lived in the way. Hands gripped the satchels, packed with herbs and scrolls. In the way eyes scanned for ravens. In the way a widow offered bread in the shape of a crescent and said nothing when asked it. It lived wherever someone decided that silence was no longer safety. That truth, even if whispered, was worth the weight of danger that night. She prepared for her final journey, not far, but final. There was a girl. She had heard of her through a thread of messages, carried village to village in baskets of oats, in bundles of lavender, in candle stubs with paper notes curled inside. The girl had been accused not once, but 3 times. Each time she had survived. Each time the verdict was unclear. Each time the fire failed to burn her. The water failed to claim her. Now the church said she was proof of the devil's interference. She would be taken to the stone tower beyond the river, a place where trials were no longer for show, where the accused were not seen again, only recorded in ledgers with red ink. The girl had 1 day left, and so the woman, the first girl, now a woman marked by winters and firelight, gathered what she needed. She took no weapons, only poultices, dried roots, a blade small enough to cut rope but not to kill, a cloak still lined with the herbs her mother had once sewn into its hem, and she left before dawn. The woods welcomed her like breath. Branches dripped with meltwater. The air carried the scent of ash and pine and something older, something. Watching, she traveled alone, but she was not unseen. Twice a child passed her a glance to knowing. Once a baker pressed a loaf into her hand and said, "May your path stay dry." And at the final village, a midwife rapped her knuckles twice on the doorframe after she left. A signal passed from one remembering soul to another. The tower came into view at dusk. It rose like a wound from the earth grey, pitted, surrounded by iron stakes and thorned hedges. Smoke curled from its chimney. Crows circled. She waited until the stars pierced the sky like needle points. Waited until the last torch in the guard's hand dimmed with fatigue. Then she moved, not as a shadow, but as something braver. She crossed the outer hedge, crawled through the root-thick ditch, reached the back wall where a moss-covered drain opened, just wide enough for someone small. And she whispered into it once, twice, 3 times. Then silence. Moments passed, then fingers small, pale reached through. The girl, alive, still waiting, still believing in something. Together they broke the rusted hinge. Together they crawled through the mud. Together they emerged, breathless, scraped, but not alone. The woman did not smile. She only took the girl's hand and pressed something into it, a charm made of twine and rosemary. "No more trials," she whispered. The girl nodded, and they ran, through fog and frost and dark, toward the forest, toward the hollow. They would not return, but their story would, carried by the girl's fingers as she wrote it down on birch bark, carried by the wind as the crows cried their strange warnings, carried by the firelight as those in distant places read the tale aloud in hidden kitchens. She was taken, but she returned. The fire did not win. The hollow was no longer a secret. It had become a story, and stories, once told, cannot be buried again. Even the church began to change, not publicly, but in hesitation, in fewer trials, in softer sermons, in priests who paused when they saw a charm tied to a door and chose, instead, to walk away. Fear had changed sides. Not completely, but enough, and the woman, the first one, the one who had once stood alone in the square, rope around her wrists, stood beneath the split tree once more, older now, her hair streaked with grey, her eyes clearer than ever, and behind her, generations not of blood, but of story. Girls who had lived, boys who had remembered, women who had spoken, Men who had turned away from silence. She did not need to lead them. She only needed to remind them. They had already survived the fire. Now it was time to carry the flame. And as the wind lifted through the forest, it carried her words like a final benediction. The trial was never meant to find the truth, but we were, and so they did.